The EPA guidelines recommend a PPE based on how much mold you see. The EPA guidelines are not based on an exposure. The EPA never did any studies and said, oh, there's 1 square foot of mold. How much is someone being exposed to? What kind of PPE do they need? Or there's 10 square feet of mold. How much mold is in the air now? They never did that. They didn't even put that much effort into it. They borrowed the 10 square foot rule and copied the text verbatim from what the New York City Department of Health first published in 2002. Guidelines on Assessment and Remediation of Fungi in Indoor Environments. New York had created the very first guidelines on mold remediation for the general public. But they were basically made for apartment tenants, people who just needed some kind of guidance. They were completely arbitrary in terms of, this is how much mold, if you see this, you should wear this kind of respirator. The trouble with the EPA guidelines and the New York guidelines, which, by the way, are generally well-written and in agreement with what's written in the S520, the standard for professional mold remediation. The trouble with the New York and the EPA guidelines with their square foot rules, if there is less than 10 square feet of mold visible, the PPE that they're suggesting that you could wear is an N95 respirator. Now, an N95 respirator is not adequate. It's been said at least 1 million spores of mold have to be present on a square inch before mold's even visible to the naked eye. So how many spores would have to be present in 10 square feet of mold? And how much is too much for you to breathe? A study done by one mold remediation company who was questioning the validity of the EPA guidelines followed the EPA recommendations and took air samples during remediation, and they found spore levels to be over 2 million per liter of air. Depending on which reference you use, the average adult, when resting, can inhale between 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 liters of air per minute. Now that amount's clearly going to be higher when performing an activity, doing an inspection or doing remediation. But let's assume 7.5 or 7 liters per minute. That would be 15 million spores inhaled per minute. Now that's during remediation, and these guys were probably cutting out drywall, disturbing it, making a mess. So we don't know how many spores on a surface are going to be in the air. It could be very little to none detected to millions. So how would you base what PPE you're going to wear on how much mold you see? And add to that, most of the mold is actually hidden. By the time you see it growing through a wall, there could be 10 square feet behind the wall when you only see 1 square inch. So the bottom line is, don't follow any guidelines based on how much mold is visible. And never even consider an N95 unless it's an emergency and it's the only thing you have. The minimum protection you should wear is a silicone half-face respirator with a HEPA cartridge, or better yet, a full-face respirator, as we'll cover in this course. Keep it simple. When in doubt, wear the full PPE, at least wear the full-face respirator. There is a standard called the S520, and it's the only ANSI-approved standard. It's gone through the rigorous process of public comment. The S520 is the only guideline and standard to suggest we should treat all mold jobs or inspections the same regardless of size. You definitely want to wear the full PPE, the suit, the full face respirator if you're going looking in places like crawl spaces or attics. Be careful. Spore counts are always less in the air when mold is not disturbed. If you find mold, don't touch it. You found it, you did a good job. Maybe you want to take a tape lift of it carefully to identify it or be sure it's mold, but be very careful. Mold spores are like dandelion weeds in the wind. They're just waiting for the gentlest of air currents to get airborne. That's their ecology. That's how they travel and grow in other places. Just like pollen, you wouldn't go shake a tree branch, go, oh, I found a tree. Let me shake that pollen on it. Leave it alone, don't touch it until you're ready for remediation. And if you're doing remediation, the S520, and I talk about this in Mold Money, you do want to remove it carefully. You don't want to use a sledgehammer. You want to use a razor blade and carefully cut out the walls, the drywall, and immediately place it in bags and vacuum as you go, because no respirator, even the full-face respirator, is 100% effective.